Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Powell Moore, and I'm here representing the Richard T. Russell Library. For the record, we're in the home of Mr. Eugene Methvin in McLean, Virginia, and the day is March 29, 2011, and we are conducting an oral history for the benefit of future generations that'll go into the new Richard B. Russell Collection Library. It's a pleasure to be here with a distinguished Georgian, a distinguished graduate of the University of Georgia, a distinguished American, and a distinguished journalist, and
Extinguished.
Who's made his mark on history. Let's start at the beginning.
Okay.
Where were you born and when?
Vienna, Georgia, September the 19th, 1934.
And tell me about the Methvins of Georgia. Who are the Methvins of Georgia?
Well, who they are, they were newspaper editors and country weekly editors. My grandfather started on the Southerner and Appeal in Irwinton, Georgia, south of Milledgeville, between Milledgeville and Dublin, in 1888. At the age of 13, he walked into the Southerner and Appeal and applied for a job, and he got a job as printer's devil, twisting the devil's tail, which meant pulling the lever on an old hand press, which printed the paper. And all the type was hand set. He learned to set type, and he became a distinguished editor in Georgia. But he did his apprenticeship on the Southerner and Appeal, and then he moved up to Thomaston, Georgia. He moved to all over South Georgia, and he became the editor of the Times Journal in Eastman, Georgia in 1900. My father was born in McRae, Georgia, Telfair Enterprise. His father was editing it at the time, and he married there in 1896, married my grandmother, who was Eugenia Bone Methvin, and I'm named for her and for my other grandmother from Eastman, from Dublin, Georgia, Eugenia Bone, no, that was Eugenia Caledonia Jackson. And her daughter was my mother.
And your father worked for your grandfather at the Eastman newspaper?
Yes, he did, until he was, well, let's see. Dad was born in 1898 in McRae, and he was raised on the newspaper. His father owned the Times Journal from 1900 on, or 1902 on, and his younger brother was editor of the Times Journal from 1941 when my grandfather died. Throughout World War II, he was a Marine Corps veteran. Edwin was also an Eagle Scout, and he became a president of the Press Association, as my grandfather had been in 1910 or 12, along with your grandfather Powell, and their sons played together as boys on the Press Association conventions.
A lot of connections there.
Yeah.
How would you say your parents influenced your success as a journalist and as a human being?
Oh, huge. Huge.
In what ways?
Well, I remember at age 12 or 13, I wanted to grow up to be a newspaper editor like my daddy. And my father tried to persuade me that there were easier ways to make a living. He says, "Oh, son, you could be a doctor or a dentist or a lawyer." He said, "All these futures should appeal to you." I said, "No, Daddy, I want to be a journalist just like you, a newspaper reporter."
A great
editor.
compliment to him.
Yeah, and it was. And he took it so. But he says, well, we'll make you the best we know how. So I started in the back end of the print shop. Actually, I'd been in the back end of the print shop all my life. I was raised there on the Vienna News.
What was it like growing up in Vienna, small town in South Georgia in the 40s and 50s?
Well, my nose wrinkles up, and I grew up in the 40s mainly. The 50s, I went away to the University of Georgia, 51, but Vienna was my cradle, really, the whole town. And, I remember reporting, my father, during World War II, had no help. He couldn't hire any help. There was no help available. All the millions of young men were overseas in the army, and so I grew up on the streets of Vienna. Literally, my mother and father both would work on the newspaper on Thursday nights. Many is the night that they bedded me down on a bale of newsprint, and I went to bed there. And woke up there the next morning. They'd still be working on the newspaper, putting it out. And I'd play on the streets of Vienna. Everybody knew me. Even the night policeman. I used to accompany him on his rounds, Thursday nights, where he'd be a lonely policeman. All the mischief makers were overseas too, fighting in the war.
Now, you once told me that your father was a courageous editor.
Oh, yeah.
How did he demonstrate that courage?
Well, this is hearsay, really. Many times I got asked later, as I was a Reader's Digest editor and a member of the President's Commission on Organized Crime, people would say to me, "Oh, Gene, aren't you threatened? Aren't you scared of the mafia?" and so forth. I'd say, listen, I never had to show the kind of courage my father had to show in Vienna, Georgia in 1936 to come out against lynching. I said there was a lynching in 1936 in Vienna, Georgia. They took a Negro out of jail and lynched him on the edge of the edge of town. And my father wrote an editorial about that on the front page. He denounced it, and as a result of that, he denounced it as this was mob violence. This was not, this was a gang, not a mob violence case. They took, they meaning the 6 or 8 of the sheriff's deputies, and the sheriff himself was colluding in this thing. They took this black man out of jail, and they strung him up on the edge of town, actually a couple of miles out of town on a country road. And then the sheriff claimed that, he was taking this black man to a nearby town, Fitzgerald, for safekeeping. There'd been rumors around town that the black man would be lynched. So the sheriff claimed that he was taking him to a nearby town for safekeeping. And they turned him over to the gang. The story was that the sheriff was near Cordele, 9 miles away, and this gang came out, this group of masked men came out of the woods and took his prisoner away from him. And the next thing he knew was he was called the next morning by a farmer who heard this fusillade of shots overnight, and they found the man hanging from a tree. Well, actually they had just taken him out of jail and turned him over to the crowd. The sheriff may have had an alibi.
Well, how was your father for editorializing against this and not covering it up? Did he pay a penalty for it?
Well, he paid a penalty, a heavy penalty for 5 years. they started another newspaper in town. They meaning the courthouse crowd. And as soon as the paper had been in existence for 1 year, they took the legal advertising away from the Vienna News and put it in the other paper, the Dooley County Citizen. And so my dad had to scrimp and save, put meat on the table through printing and commercial printing, outside circulars with Jewish merchants all over the South. They came to Dad because he was a better printer, and he could stuff more type into a printer's form or into chasers than anybody else. And he could print these big black letters, sales, so forth. And that's the way we made a living in the 30s and the 40s, printing those circulars.
And you went to the University of Georgia in 1951?
Yep.
Did you ever consider going any other place other than the University?
Well, the only place I thought about was Davidson College. I was enamored of FDR, and I understood that Davidson played football in a league that
was less competitive, though.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And that all students at Davidson were expected to play one sport or another. So I looked at Davidson, I wrote for a catalog, but the University of Georgia had a journalism school, and I just decided as a future journalist that was a school for me.
Did you visit the campus before you went?
Once.
Tell us about that.
Well, in the 7th grade, the superintendent of the schools in Dooley County, Vienna, Georgia, Walter Stone, spoke at our 7th grade graduation. And he announced from the stage that this class would be the first to go through 12 grades in Vienna, Georgia. Well, I remember sitting on the stage and thinking, I'll be damned if I'm going to stick around this town an extra year. And I went home and told my dad that. And he said, well, son, we will see if we can arrange it for you to go to the University of Georgia after 11 grades. So he took me that summer up to Athens as the first trip for all of us. My mother, my father, and I went up to Athens and saw Dean Drury, the journalism school. And the dean took us into his inner office and talked to me, principally. And he reviewed what I needed to do to get into the University of Georgia. And at the age of 17 or 16, after the 11th grade.
Would you say that, how did, what influence did Dean Drury have on your?
Oh, great. He was a grand teacher, and he let me do most anything I wanted to do in the journalism school because he knew my background, and he knew I knew more about journalism when I got to the university than most graduates did when they left, and most of the professors. I knew more about printing and so forth in the back end of a newspaper.
Who else had an influence on you while you were at the University of Georgia?
Oh, Dr. John Downs, French department. He taught French, and he took a shine to me in the freshman class. And I remember he spoke French one day, and he says, "Voici Monsieur Methven. Here's Mr. Methvin." And he speaks French better than most students, and he comes off the football team. He plays football. Il joue au football. And he says, "I promise never to say anything about Wally Butts' team again." It says, "Mr. Methvin plays football, and he speaks French so well." and I won the, Dr. Downs gave me that year the prize for the best student in oral French. And he tried to get me to major. Professor Roosevelt Walker taught Shakespeare. He'd been on the Macon Telegraph. And he was one of my professors and one of my instructors. I took extra courses in Shakespeare because of Professor Walker. You know, I learned very early that you majored more in who was teaching the course, who were the good teachers, than excuse me, than the you took courses based on who was the good teacher of the course, and you took if the teacher taught more courses that you could take, then you take them under that teacher.
I assume you worked on the red and black.
One quarter, no, one year only, because I found out my freshman year that you can't be two places at once. That was a terrible decision to make, because I found out I couldn't play football and be at practice and be on the red and black too. And so at Christmas time, the photographer of the red and black, Mike Edwards, who later worked at the National Geographic here in Washington, Mike was a photographer from Marietta, and he ran away and married the prettiest girl in the journalism school, Lynn Edwards, and didn't come back, and left me holding the bag, because I was the only other photographer on the red and black who knew how to handle a press camera. So I got stuck with that job in the winter and spring quarters, and I was a harried boy, I'll tell you, running from pillar to post and football practice. And
what made you decide to play football at Georgia?
You know, that's a good question. I'm not sure, but I just remember the Notre Dame story on a movie that came out when I was about 4 years old, and Pat O'Brien and a guy who later became president of the United States, Ronald Reagan, starred in that movie, and I think that inspired me. Plus, all of my uncles, and they would listen to the football games on the radio, and with such concentration, the same kind of concentration they listened to Edward R. Murrow in his "This Is London" broadcasts. And
what was it like? What about your relationship with Coach Butts? What was that like?
Oh,
And Quentin Lumpkin and some of those.
yeah, they were.
Bill Hartman and some of those.
They they took a protective attitude toward me because I was the only student, non-scholarship type, and the term was invented. I mean, it was before the term walk-on was invented, and I was a walk-on. They didn't know what to do with me, and they didn't. As I said, they just didn't know what to do with me hardly, and they took a glory in coaching this kid who'd never played football before, because Vienna didn't have a football team. It wasn't big enough. It had a basketball team. And
now you also, in addition to being a student and a football player, you interned, did you not?
Oh yeah, Dean Drury, after my freshman year, recommended me to the Atlanta Constitution to fill one of the summer internships. Those were usually reserved for about to be seniors, and I got a letter one day from Bill Fields, the managing editor, saying I'd been recommended by Dean Drury for a summer internship, and would I please come to see him. So I went up, Paul Burton and I together. Paul was about to be a graduating senior, and Dean, Mr. Fields took us into his office, and he says, well now, what do you want to be and do what do you want to be on the paper? He meant on the paper, you know, what do you want to be? And Paul spoke up eagerly. He says, well, I want to be editor. So Dean, I mean,
that was a good experience, I guess.
yeah. Oh, it was a great experience. But Paul says, I want to be editor. And so he spent the whole summer of his internship on obits, writing obituaries.
What was your beat?
Well, my beat was general assignment reporter, but it consisted largely or heavily of police and courts. And I got sent down to cover for Keeler McCartney, the police reporter, on weekends and his nights off. And
is that where your interest in criminal justice issues originated?
That's right. I went back to Athens. Keeler took me around and showed me the ropes at the police station in Atlanta, and he showed me the docket for the jail, and it said, arrested, so-and-so was arrested on suspicion of burglary, suspicion of robbery, etc. I looked at that, and 17-year-olds had not begun to straighten out the world in 1951 or 52. And I looked at that and thought, well, that conflicts with Ms. Yao's teachings at the university, at Vienna High School. You know, she taught that you can't be arrested without a warrant, without probable cause, and put in jail. And his on suspicion stuff raised my suspicions. And I thought, well, I said, Keeler, how about this? You know, how does it square with the Fourth Amendment? You can't be arrested, etc. He says, well, this is just the way they do it. And I thought, well, if that's the way they do it, they got to have some knowledge in the law school there that I need to cover crime in courts. So I went back to Athens, and I went to law school for a year. Only I went in and told the dean of the law school, I said, Dean Alton Hush, I said, I want to come to law school, but I don't want to be a lawyer. I just want to be a better journalist. He says, well, that's why we have a combined curriculum. He says, but we don't have many students who come in and say they don't want to be lawyers. So he says to me, well, you take my contracts course fall quarter, and if you do okay in that, we'll let you into the law school to take anything you want. Well, I did all right in his class, I guess. And so they let me take evidence, practice, procedure, criminal law, other courses, and I skipped a lot of courses like civil. I mean, I took practice and procedure and evidence, but I didn't take divorce law and things like that.
Well, when you finish the University of Georgia, like most of us in those days, you faced a military obligation. I know you served in the Air Force. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay. Well, in 1955, I graduated on a Monday. And the next Monday, I reported into Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, San Antonio. Pre-flight, 90 days of pre-flight. Then I went to flight school.
And where'd you go to flight school?
Well, I went to Big Spring, Texas, Webb Air Force Base. But before that, that was jet training. Before that, I had primary training in Moultrie, Georgia. And that is 65 miles from Vienna, Georgia. And I was courting a young lady who was a star of Vienna High School, the most beautiful girl in 2 counties, because she won beauty contest in Macon and Dooley County. And she was the smartest thing around. And so I kept the roads hot.
Yeah. You an officer in the Air Force when you met this high school girl?
No, that was the summer after my father died in 1953.
Yeah.
He died on June the 4th, 1953. And I met Barbara in October because the varsity went to Boston College to play, and the B team was let out. They said you can go home. So we went home, and Vienna had just become the the county high school for they just consolidated 2 or 3 high school teams or high schools into Vienna, and Barbara's high school was one of them, Byronville. So she became a Vienna high school cheerleader, and I remember sitting up on the edge of my seat and saying, "Who is that?" when she came out on the floor. I went to a high school basketball game that weekend, and
when were you married?
Well, we were married after I got out of the Air Force in '58.
You were out of the Air Force when you married her?
Yeah.
Did you have any reserve obligation after that?
Yeah. I did. I served for 10 or 12 years in the reserves.
What rank were you when you?
Captain.
So, when you left the Air Force, what'd you do then?
I got a job as a reporter on the Washington Daily News.
Tell us how that happened.
Well, that was as a result of family connections or family reputation. And the instrument or the person who helped pave the way was Stanford Smith, who was by then he was the president, or he later became the executive vice president of the American Newspaper Publishers Association. He had been hired by my uncle in 1948 as secretary manager of the Georgia Press Association. My uncle was president, and Martha Smith and I had served on the Atlanta Constitution together. Martha was a reporter, and she knew me, and Stan knew me by reputation. And so I wrote to Stan. I said, "Stan, I'm coming out of the Air Force in March, and I want a newspaper job on a major daily newspaper." And he wrote back, he said, "Well, Gene, I normally don't get involved in this kind of thing, but," he said, "in your case, I'm going to make an exception because you have such an excellent record." I sent him some copies of things I'd done in the Vienna News, and he didn't sniff it, though.
So what was life like on a big city daily at that period of time? You faced an unusual situation that we don't find today, and that you were in a 3 newspaper town. You had
I had been raised in a 2 newspaper town, you know.
Yeah.
My father had angered the powers that be, and I was a 4-year-old toddler then, and I wandered into the Chevrolet place, which was a place up the street, and they had a Cracker Barrel group around there, kind of around the fireplace, an big old coal heated oven cylinder, and they were ragging me about the newspaper and so forth. "Oh, Eugene Methvin, you represent what paper? The Dooley County Citizen?" "No." You know, I says to that assembled group of adults, I looked around the crowd, I said, "Y'all are just a bunch of old damn fools." And then I looked up and saw the Baptist minister there, and I said, "All except you, 'cause you work in a church house." Well, he told that story on me on Sunday in his sermon. It wouldn't do.
Were you in the congregation when he told it?
No, I don't know. this was one of the legendary stories about me in buying a paper. And so a 2 newspaper town, 3 newspaper town, I didn't care. We had the Washington Star, and that was our direct competition for afternoon publication. We were the Daily News. We were the 3rd newspaper in town. Really, the Washington Post was dominant morning. So we had a going time of it. And the Daily News folded in 1972, 12 years after I left, and Star about 10 years later.
Yeah, I remember. What was your beat on the Daily News?
Well, I didn't have a beat. I was general assignment reporter, which meant you covered everything. You could be covering a fire or chasing an ambulance 1 minute and the White House the next. The Daily News was the best newspaper in the East Coast of the United States for a young reporter to start on. Because of that, they had a smaller staff, demanded more versatility, and I covered it all.
As I remember, it was a tabloid in
yes,
printing
it was
style,
a tabloid,
but not in journalism style.
No, it was a tabloid, and it had the earliest deadline on the East Coast of the United States, 8:15 in the mornings, because it had to make the 10 o'clock coffee break for government workers.
Well, here you were, under 30 years old, and you were moving around among the big hitters in journalism.
Well, I was only 22 then.
Yeah.
23.
And who were some of the memorable journalists at the time that you would tell us about that made an impression on you?
That came later with the Reader's Digest, really. I joined the Digest after 2 years on the Daily News, under 2 years actually, and the heavy hitters then were Mark Childs, Walter Lippmann, others, but the best journalists I knew up close were on the Reader's Digest. Chuck Stevenson, the bureau chief, Ken Gilmore, Ken was the future future editor of the Reader's Digest out of the Washington office.
How did you connect with the
and DeWitt Wallace? Go ahead.
How did you connect with the Reader's Digest?
Well,
tell us about them. Did you go to them, or did they come to you?
They came to me. I got assigned to do a series on the Daily News on unemployment compensation. And the editor of the Daily News, John O'Rourke, picked me out to do that series, I guess, because he recognized he had a reporter here who had a penchant could do analysis and depth reporting, and so he picked me out, walked out of the office one day, and he says, "Gene, do us a story on unemployment compensation." He was angered by the composing room's turnover of printers. They would come and work till they could qualify for the old rocking chair money, and then they'd go take a vacation. And it ran up the Reader's Digest, the Daily News' premium. He got mad about that one day, and he says, "Go do us a story on this." Well, I did a series of stories. 4 started out to be a 3-part series. They wound up doing a 4-part series on that. And then I got a call one day from Ken Gilmore of the Reader's Digest. He was he'd been there for 3 years, and he said he was working on a story on unemployment compensation nationally, and he said he wanted to pick my brain. So I went to lunch with him. He says to me at the end of the lunch, he says, "We're looking for somebody to hire on." He said, "Why don't you call our bureau chief?" I said, "Well, all right, I'll make a note of that. So I didn't call for 3 weeks, and Chuck Stevenson called me. He wanted to go to lunch. Turned out DeWitt Wallace had decided that Chuck Stevenson was the best journalism professor he knew. Chuck was turning out stories that Wally liked, and he'd given a go-ahead to hire for the Washington Bureau. Now, we went from 2 to 3. I was a 50% increase in manpower. And women didn't figure that in that day and time. Eleanor Greist was there. She was Chuck's assistant. She was his research assistant, which was about the limit, I guess, of what you could aspire to be as a woman on the Reader's Digest. The situation was similar on the Geographic, I know, because I had a later good friend there, female, who told about coming to work there in 1946, and she says she was a graduate of the top college. She was the daughter of the governor of Minnesota, Yelmer Peterson, and she says all she could do was secretarial work. So she did that. Sandra Day O'Connor had the same situation coming out of law school.
Yeah. What was the first big story you assigned to do on the Reader's Digest?
Oh, the first big story? Well, I remember what I went to work on the first day that I was at the Digest was the Rural Electrification Administration, the REA, and its satellite lobby, the NRECA, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, an association created of the co-ops which were funded by the federal government. And so that was the anchor side of the Iron Triangle, or the Golden Triangle. And the Iron Triangle in Washington, or the Golden Triangle, is the bureaucracy, the federal bureaucracy, the congressional committees involved, and the association, the grassroots association. That's a classic combination in Washington, and it creates a grand distortion of our government. And it's what Professor James Buchanan, many years later, 1987 or so, won a Nobel Prize in economics for writing about it. And I read the New York Times account of what he won for. It's called Public Choice Economics. And I thought, well, hell, that's what we've been doing in the Reader's Digest for years, writing about the distortions of the Iron Triangle. I said, we did a number of stories on that situation. I remember I read the book, classic work on it, on the subject, was Political Parties. I think that was the title of it. 1916 by, his name will come to me in a minute. Anyhow, 1916, he wrote a book about political parties in Europe, Robert Michels, Michels. And I read it at the time, describing the Iron Triangle, or basically what he said was there is a terrible distorting factor in organizations he called it the iron law of oligarchy, and that is once an organization or a group reaches the point where it needs a professional staff, there is a divergence in interests between the professional staff and the organization, or the rank and file members of the organization that the group is called into being to exist for. There's a divergence of interest, a conflict of interest, really, between professionals and the grassroots interest group.
Certainly is prevalent today.
Oh yeah, very influential in Washington. I later wrote an article called, let's see, the NRECA got us started on that topic. That was the first day I went to work for the Reader's Digest. And it was the NRECA, the REA story of a, what's the title of that story? Something about a lobby run wild. I later did a story about the NEA, the National Education Association. Now there's a group that creates terrible distortions in the educational system of the United States. And that was a story. That was a story they called NEA, the story of a Washington lobby run wild. That's 1979.
That was certainly prophetic.
Yeah.
I assume rural electrification was pretty popular in Dooley County.
Oh yeah.
Did this? Was there any feedback as a result in Dooley County as a result?
Oh
of
yeah.
that?
You see, my parents had helped organize the co-op in 1937, 38, and then the NRECA got organized, and that history is memorialized in the fact that originally the slogan was 35, 36, 37, owned by those we serve. And they dropped that real quickly after World War II because Clyde Ellis, the major domo he was a beaten congressman from Arkansas. Bill Fulbright beat him when he ran for the Senate. So he was looking for a job, and he figured out that he could organize these co-ops into a lobby, and he made the most powerful lobby in Washington. They're feared today.
For sure. What was the most highly acclaimed story you wrote as a reporter for the?
Well, highly acclaimed. You know, acclamation applies to audience recipients. They acclaim a story. The most influential story I ever did was Mafia versus the ANP, the Mafia war on the ANP.
The grocery chain.
The grocery chain.
Tell us about that story.
Well, that story dealt with 1970. 1970 it appeared in the summer of that year. And let's see, Mafia War in the ANP. That story appeared in that summer issue. Now, that went back over a year because I started that story. DeWitt Wallace himself called me up one Sunday at home. That didn't happen every day. From the founder and owner of the Reader's Digest, I only got one phone call on a Sunday at home, and he says to me, "Gene, do you think it would be a good idea if," that's his way of doing things. He would always ask a question. He would never give orders. He says, "Do you think it'd be a good idea if we had a series on organized crime?" And I said, "Well, Wally, to be honest with you," I said, "I don't think so. I hadn't thought of it." I said, "But now that you mention it, I think it'd be an excellent idea."
Yeah.
That was his way of doing business. Yeah. He asked the question. He didn't give directions. And then he says, "Well, would you and Ken was by 1969, he was the bureau chief and the future editor of the Reader's Digest, editor-in-chief. He says, would you and Ken please put together an outline for a series and send it up to Pleasantville and let's see what happens." Well, what happened was, we went to work the next day. We dropped everything else off the plate and went to work on organized crime. We made ourselves educated. We got an education on it. These books will attest to that. And for a year more or less, we didn't do anything but study organized crime. I didn't anyway. Ken did other things. And I decided our story would be the mafia war on the A&P.
About that time, President Nixon came into office, and he required the Justice Department to stop using the word mafia and refer to organized crime.
Well, that was a deferral to the Italian voter group.
Was that a good idea or a bad idea?
Bad idea. Because it was a demonstration of the power of organized crime, really, of the mafia, which was the spine of organized crime in the United States. Now, it involved all kinds of people, the Syrians, the Lebanese, the Irish mob, but all of them paid tribute to the mafia. And they were the best organized lobby. I mean, not lobby, but crime group. They had 26 families or gangs in 26 cities. And that was enough to, in a centrally directed group nationally, the National Mob Commission. And it had existed in the United States from 1930, 29 on.
You served on a task force that President Reagan appointed, as I remember, on organized crime.
Yes, it was a presidential commission he appointed in 1983, and it had a duration of 3 years. And they were looking for somebody they were looking for a reporter to balance off the political types.
So who else was on that commission?
Well, I remember Potter Stewart.
He was off the court by then.
Yeah, he was retired Supreme Court Justice. We had Peter Rodino, who was chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. We had...
He was out of office by then.
No.
He was just sitting...
No, Congress put 2 members, the House and the Senate. The Senate member was Strom Thurmond. And we had 18 or 19 members, and they included Sam Skinner from Chicago, the former U.S. attorney out there. It's all on the record.
Bob Blakey.
Yeah, no, Bob Blakey was not on it. Bob Blakey was the he was a Senate Judiciary Committee expert on organized crime in 1968 and 9, and he wrote the statutes on wiretapping and on organized crime, the RICO Act, the RICO statute, all those things which went into the Omnibus Crime Act of 1970, organized crime. And that's where Nixon came into play, and I suspect I've always suspected that there was a connection to Wally, DeWitt Wallace, of the Reader's Digest, because the Senate had passed the Organized Crime Act in 1969. They passed it 59 or 99 to 1 or something like that. And the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee was then Manny Seller.
Yeah.
And he had said that he would not, he was a big civil libertarian from, at least that was his public pose, from Brooklyn. Now, Brooklyn was swarmed with the Longshoremen's Union, and they owned that district, and they put Manny Seller where he was. They elected him time and again, and he knew it. And so he announced that he was not going to hold hearings on this bill, which he regarded as a great invasion of civil liberties, etc. And so at that point, here comes old Gene stumbling into the picture, looks around and sees the mafia war on the A&P. And DeWitt Wallace was behind this. And I've always suspected that Wally had a connection somehow. Somebody telephoned Wally,
Told him.
probably from the White House, and told him the situation. And he said, well, I'll call Eugene Methvin in Washington and see what he thinks about a series on organized crime. Well, then I walked into the picture, and I got to know Bob Blakey. He was the Senate's expert on organized crime. He'd been on Robert Kennedy's staff at the Justice Department. He'd been a racket-busting prosecutor, and Bob had drafted the wiretap statute that authorized wiretapping, which up to that point had been on a 1935 law that I later found out Lou Nichols told me that story, how that law got passed, etc.
So what do you think the situation with organized crime is today? Do you think some of the exposure that the Reader's Digest is responsible for, and the commission you served on, and you think that organized crime is less of a threat today than it?
Well, you started out by asking about that 1970 article. I started out telling you about that 1970 article, and that article plus one other, which appeared 3 months later, on how the mafia preys on the poor. Everything then was keyed to the poor. Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, etc. And everybody was going to defeat poverty. And the mafia war on the poor was a figure, critical figure. Those two stories in May and September of 1970 broke the hold of Manny Seller on this act. And he was later asked, he announced he was going to hold hearings on the act. And the staff director of the committee came in and said, Mr. Chairman, I didn't think you were going to hold hearings on that bill. He said, yeah, but I got to get that goddamn Reader's Digest off my neck.
Well, that was a very nice compliment.
Well, it was, and we printed it too. But anyway, we heard about it later.
But what would you say about organized crime today? Would you say it's less of a threat to our society than a...
Well, today it's more of a threat if you realize that it's now internationally connected, and it's involves Sicilians and Latin Americans. We now have an international cartel, crime cartels, like the mafia. They
to what extent do they thrive on our appetite for drugs in the United States?
Oh yeah, that's the thing that I was about to mention. The drugs, the appetite for drugs, supplying that, it takes international cooperation and collaboration, and they supply the organizations to do it. The Sicilian mafia and the U.S. mafia collaborate, and they are the orchestral leaders, and they wave the baton, and everybody else plays accordingly. Now you got Latin American cartels, the Cali cartel, etc., Colombia, this, that, and the other, but they all jump to the mafias. They use the mafia as a central organization.
Anything else you want to mention about the mafia that should?
Well, I should go back to this 1970 article, which finally it got the hold of Manny Sella broken, and that came about because the article appeared in May and September of 1970 with the May of 1970 with the election pending that fall, and Manny Sella finally, the September issue article produced such a racket in the mail bags of Capitol Hill that the congressmen were afraid to go home and face the voters. And our article was designed to do that. It ended up pointing at Manny Sella and the committee in the House and says, basically, it said, you got to vote against these scoundrels in the House of Representatives who are going to do the mafia's bidding if you don't take part in the election. And so Manny Sella, the House started a discharge petition, the rank and filers, to discharge the committee of responsibility for that legislation. They were blocking it. Manny Sella had set hearings on it, and within a couple of days they had practically enough signatures on their petition to discharge the committee of the petition. And then the Manny Sella came to the House leadership and says, "Don't let the fellas do that to me. It'd be a disgrace. I'll bring the legislation out." So he brought it out to the floor, and it was just an oceanic upheaval. He lost on the floor. He tried to pull the teeth of the legislation, which involved the RICO Act, the RICO, which you hear about, racketeer influence criminal organizations. Bob Blakey designed that damn thing for not only the mafia, but for all organized crime. It was not aimed at just the mafia. It was aimed at the Syrians, the Lebanese, the Latins, anybody who got organized. It said basically, the core offense here is using violence and criminal activity to advance an organization. And he designed that statute for that crime. Now, he also designed, in part of that Omnibus 1970 Act, was the witness program. That busted the hell out of the so-called omerta code of the mafia.
Is there any other person that you would think of who, I'm sure they didn't have mafia ties, but might have been influenced in their political behavior by the mafia?
Yeah. Franklin D. Roosevelt was influenced in his behavior. He sat down at the Peacock Lounge in the Waldorf Astoria in New York with Longies Wellman when he was a candidate for the President of the United States, 1932.
Anybody else?
Chairman Rodino, yeah. He was a member of our commission. And there were 302s around, that's FBI reports of interviews. Every agent fills out after an interview with anybody a 302. And then they have to turn them over now in the court order to defense attorneys. So the defense attorneys are the source of leaks to reporters. And those 302s are basically leaked documents. And there were 302s around on Jackie Presser. He was Teamster Union president. Well,
there's a debate underway now about how to deal with Al-Qaeda, whether they should be dealt with as criminals or enemy combatants. in the same way we dealt with the Nazi saboteurs in World War II.
Yeah.
What do you think about that debate? Do you?
Well, that's a whole nother bag from organized crime, and the courts in the United States are not fit. They're not suited by their own decisions, namely the decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. courts are not suited for policing anything really anymore because they exclude so much evidence. The exclusionary rule, which goes back to 1914, etc., the Weeks case, the judges are made responsible for deciding what evidence will be allowed to go to the jury. And the jury doesn't get a full picture. So the worst, and that's where the wiretap statute came in, because in 1966, the Attorney General, under orders from Lyndon Johnson, ordered a stop of the FBI's wiretap program. They stopped everything. So the FBI was blind. Now, J. Edgar Hoover took some steps to end that blindness, namely, well, let's put it this way. Life magazine came out with a series on organized crime written by Sandy Smith of Chicago, a Chicago background, and he had FBI wiretap logs, or wiretaps. He had the actual transcripts of wiretaps and describing the murders of mobsters, etc., and dramatically, blood and guts does go a long way in crime writing.
Now, the president's authority to conduct national security wiretaps were restricted somewhat with the passage of the FISA Act, the Foreign Intelligence.
No, that was a Jimmy Carter thing. 1976, I think, 78, FISA, Federal
Intelligence,
Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Now that Griffin Bell later apologized more or less for. He got hung with the duty of going to Capitol Hill and lobbying to reverse a vote of the House of Representatives on pulling the teeth of that law, which Jimmy Carter signed, and a member of the House who'd been an FBI agent stood on the floor and he says, President Carter may be able to sign this law if he wants to, but he can make policy for his own administration, but he cannot put in law something that contravenes the Constitution of the United States. Well, that was overridden.
Who was that former FBI agent? Do you remember?
Rudd from Arizona.
Yeah, Eldon Rudd, yeah.
That wiretap statute, it goes back, the exclusionary rule, see, when they passed the 1970 Act, oh, you're tapping my memory.
Do you think that the president, in his capacity as commander-in-chief, should be able to tap telephones without a warrant?
Oh, he ought to be able to listen to everybody's conversation in the world. And now we have the internet, which allows, and that by the way is why the exclusionary rule which the judges invented in 1914 and was applied to the federal courts originally only, and then in 1961 was applied to the states. And by the way, it was applied to the states in a terrorism case. Let me see. I talked to the Cargan was his name. He was the DA who in Cleveland, Ohio, the state DA, and Dolly Mapp, the Mapp case, applied the Weeks exclusionary rule to the states, and said state judges may not order wiretaps either, or may not admit evidence that violates exclusionary rule. Well, that case involved Dolly Mapp in Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, and she was booked for having pornographic materials in her upstairs bedroom, and the cops went in and seized that and brought a case against her. Well, they were looking for her boyfriend who was guilty of bombing in Cleveland. He'd planted several bombs in the numbers racket, which was mobbed up, and they were trying to chase him down, and the DA says all they could get, they went to Dolly Mapp's house looking for Mr. whatever his name was, the bomber, and Dolly Mapp said, y'all can't come in my house and look for evidence. You can't look for George, who's the bomber, etc. And they went in anyway. They holed up outside the house. They sought a warrant. They couldn't find a judge. This was on a weekend. They couldn't find a judge, so they went in anyway. They forced their way on in, and they found pornographic materials under her bed upstairs. So they made a case against her because she had objected. She'd forced them to go hunting a judge, and this was a spite case. But the Supreme Court argued it, heard the arguments on the basis of freedom of press.
What year was that?
1961. So they applied the rule to the states then, and the DA says, well, basically, the case was argued on the freedom of the homeowner's right to press, right to the press. She First Amendment grounds. But the case really involved crime and chasing this terrorist who was setting off bombs in Cleveland. And that was never argued before the Supreme Court. They didn't let any evidence in on that score. They didn't discuss it. You read that case in the law books today, and it just sounds wonderful. You got freedom to look at dirty pictures in your house if you want to. So it's a civil liberties issue for the lawyers, but it's a law enforcement issue for the cops. And
do you anything happened when you were growing up in Vienna that likely to lead you to this tremendous interest in organized crime, racketeering?
Yeah. I used to. I used to hang out. The only thing doing in town, around town, was the court week. When they'd have court week at the courthouse, I used to go up and hang in the windows, sit outside the courtroom, I'd slip in, sit in the windows, and listen to the lawyers. And T. Hart Davis was the lawyer. T. Hart Jr. was the lawyer. His daddy was a law partner to Walter George, the U.S. Senator, and he later became a judge, courtesy of Senator George. And I'd listen to the lawyers argue.
Then you covered police and courts at the in Atlanta and in Washington.
Yeah.
And then
I
included
started
a year at law school and so forth. It just
I started on the police beat when I was 7 or 8.
yeah.
By the time I was 13, I was writing courts on Dooley County Courthouse. I remember an editorial in the Atlanta Constitution cited an article that I wrote at the time. The newly elected judge charged the grand jury in Vienna about chasing Ku Kluxers. And the new judge had been elected by my parents in the paper. He was a Dooley Countyan, by the way, Wendell Horn, Cordial Judicial Circuit. And Wendell charged the grand jury. Basically, it said, you know, Americans can be elected, Americans can be governed as they want or as they demand. Their government is as clean and as good and as great as the American people. And the grand jury is one of the implements. So he gave this good lecture on the grand jury's powers as his inaugural charge to the grand jury in Dooley County, and I wrote the story. 13 years old, 12.
And the Lumpkin School of Law obviously contributed to your...
Well, obviously they did, but the Atlanta Constitution picked up my story and wrote an editorial about it, and that was big stuff in Vienna, you know.
When you were 13, the story...
Oh, yeah.
Interesting. Well, that was quite an achievement.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one story that you, I think, have talked about a good bit and have a substantial file that is now down at the University of Georgia. It's the one you did on the Church of the Scientology.
Oh, yeah.
Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, Scientology was a cult in Washington, D.C., because the founder of the cult, L. Ron Hubbard, had this fascination with political power. And he started out the first Church of Scientology in Washington. It was not an accident that it was in Washington, the center of power for the universe, so says President.
Anyway.
Yeah. Anyhow.
Well, the Church of the Scientology is still thriving a good bit, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. It's doing very well, I think.
Is it? But it's...
Well, it's wounded, and it has been wounded heavily by, through the years, by stories like mine, by a lot of journalists who've gotten into it. But I got into it after the FBI raided its Washington headquarters and its Los Angeles headquarters, and came away with a bunch of documents demonstrating what went on in Scientology. And what went on was the abuse of its members. They'd take anybody who had any money, any trust fund. They'd take kids who were wet behind the ears, still wet, who'd been left considerable fortunes by their grandparents and others. And the first thing they do was vacuum clean them of their money. Now, those words are from a sales director of the Washington Church of Scientology. He said the first thing we do would be to vacuum clean them of their money, and then we'd convert them into what later became known as Rondroids. They'd be Scientologists, and they'd be salesmen for the Scientology, trying to bring in other rich kids. Scientology and I, after a 2-year course of reading on the thing, I called them an international fraud franchising racket masquerading as a religion. And that was correct based on my 2 years of research in 1980, 81.
What was the impact of your stories on the church?
Well, it crippled them.
Yeah.
It hurt them. And those stories are still reproduced and reprinted widely today. And they're still valid because they describe the process. And the Church of Scientology is like the Mormon Church in that it is poised between an evolution and sticking to its original principles. The original principles of the Mormon Church were abandoned through the years under pressure from the public, the United States government. It originally, it was founded by Joseph Smith, who was a ne'er-do-well bounder and a fraud artist in New York State. And he concocted this story, these golden tablets and so on. And the Mormon Church has evolved today into a fairly moderate religious group. It's peculiar in its origins, but it's a socially constructive group today. I don't think you can find a Mormon Church that is not led by good people, and many of them are good folks. And even in our own time, they've evolved from a racist organization that wouldn't let in blacks to now they have black members. And that's come about as a result of public pressure. And the Scientologists are poised right now. You see, Ron Hubbard, who founded the thing, he was a rascal from the word back, from the word go. But he died in 1976, 86. I forget. It's on record. But he is the guy who said, if a man wants to make $1 million, he ought to start his own religion. He said that repeatedly to audiences that came to hear him, science fiction writers. He was a science fiction writer originally, and he was a scoundrel originally too.
Now, Gene, you've written a couple of books. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the 2 books that you've written?
Well, there they are on the wall, the covers: The Rise of Radicalism and The Riot Makers. The Riot Makers appeared first in 1970, The Rise of Radicalism in 1973, but the reverse order was the order of their writing. I mean, I wrote The Rise of Radicalism first, put it in a desk drawer, and it collected dust. When the Riot Makers came along in the late 60s.
Who was your publisher? You remember?
Yeah. Arlington House.
Yeah, okay.
Conservative Book Club, etc.
You think that the books predicted the era that we live in now, where we're concerned about terrorism and we've been victimized by terrorism?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Hey, let's take a break.
Okay. Well, good afternoon. We're back with Mr. Eugene Methvin in his home in McLean, Virginia, after having taken a little break for lunch. I think, as I remember, Gene, when we broke for lunch, we were talking about your 2 books.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add to what we were saying?
Well, I was really just getting started on them. But we can be all afternoon with those. or The Riot Makers was the first book published, and The Rise of Radicalism came second, but it was the first book written. And that came about because of an abiding curiosity I had into the radical personality, the personality who wants to destroy everything. And my first 5 years with the Reader's Digest, I delved into that. Then I got into riots, really because of DeWitt Wallace and his abiding curiosity about everything. We talked about the greatest journalist I've ever known. He was the greatest, undoubtedly.
Mm-hmm.
And he built the magazine into the world's largest audience for a printed, the world's largest paid audience for a printed, paying audience for a printed medium.
Mm-hmm.
And it was my privilege to work for that medium for most of its great years, from 1960 to 1990, or 95, or 2000 really. I worked for those readers. Wally used to say, the Reader's Digest is an association of readers, and that's Reader's Digest Association. He called it that. And he considered it a service for readers, not an advertising medium. It didn't take advertising until 1950, when I was still in high school. But he considered it an association of readers, and he wanted writers who could go out and find out what was going on in the world and come back and write it for an audience of the world's largest reading audience.
Now, if I remember correctly, you wrote a number of articles for the Reader's Digest and put someone else's byline on it.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's true. That happened a lot. I wrote for Chief Justice Berger, President Carter, President, not Reagan. I didn't ever write a piece for Reagan. Carter and one of the others.
Okay. We
and senators and congressmen repeatedly.
We talked this morning a good bit about the mafia.
Yeah.
And the Scientology church and so forth. But the truth is that during your journalism career, the factor that overhung your journalism career and provided the backdrop for your journalism career was the Cold War, the struggle between the United States and what Ronald Reagan described as the evil empire.
That's correct.
And
he understood something there, and that is the commonality between the evil empire, the communist movement, and the American mafia, and that is the psychopathic personality.
Interesting. Go into that a little bit. I mean, we see these, we see a lot of evil in the world.
Yeah.
And those of us who grew up as you and I did have sometimes a hard time understanding it when we go to Dachau or to mass graves.
Let me tell you about that. DeWitt Wallace and Adolf Hitler were born in the same year, 1889. And DeWitt Wallace outlived Hitler by, 45 to 81. And he represents one end of the human spectrum. Hitler represents the other end of the spectrum of evil. And they both represent human personalities. One totally destructive, one totally constructive. Wally's characteristics, one Madison Avenue and executive assigned his research people in 1950 when the Digest started taking advertising. He said, well, let's Reader's Digest, let's find out about it. What's its secret? What's its formula? And the guy's research department came back and said, Chief, we don't know. All we can say is there's a guy up in Pleasantville, New York, who, if he likes an article, it means automatically 15 million other Americans will love it too.
Now, who was that
That was a research assistant at Madison Avenue.
Oh, okay.
Advertising firm.
Yeah.
And
Interesting that.
yeah.
That instinct.
And Wally had it, and it accounted for my career really. After I joined the Reader's Digest in February 1960, in August 1960, there was a series of demonstrations and riots in Tokyo, Japan, against the visit of the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, and the security people wound up putting the kibosh on Eisenhower's visit. He had intended to stitch together the old wounds of the war, and the Japanese, Zengakuren, the Young Communist Leagues, and the communists put on riots and demonstrations in Tokyo that forced Eisenhower to cancel that mission. And Wally sat down and wrote a little sheet paper. He scrawled on these yellow scratch pads. He said, all the newspapers say these are communist-inspired riots. How do we know? If you're communist, how do you start a riot? Do they have a how to do it handbook someplace? And if so, let's get a copy and condense it for our readers so they can understand too. And that floated down onto my desk. I was the youngest idiot apprentice in the Washington Bureau. I was number 3 behind Chuck Stevenson, Ken Gilmore. And it floated onto my desk. And I took it up to the boss. I said, "Boss, what do I do with this?" He looked at it and he said, "Well, this is from DeWitt Wallace. He wrote it by hand." He says, "Now that, by golly, was a mark of respect, by the way, because Wally's interests were abiding curious, a topic of curiosity to everybody in Pleasantville, because Wally didn't, by this stage of the game, he was one of the richest men in the world, and he headed one of the largest publications. And what he thought and what he said, and his utterances were like gold dropped onto a desk. And I didn't appreciate it, and I didn't kowtow to it particularly. And by which I mean, I always gave Wally a straight answer when he asked a question, and so on. And I think that's a characteristic that appealed to him about me, because I later understood there were several efforts to fire me, and he intervened. But anyway, Joe Parham of the Macon Telegraph used to joke and tell people at the ASNE conventions in Washington that I was the illegitimate son of DeWitt Wallace and was going to inherit the Reader's Digest. But Parham was a great storyteller.
Yeah.
Anyway, this thing floated down onto my desk, and I started researching riots. 1960, please. And I went to the Library of Congress and looked up riots. There was one book under the title of Riots, and it was a U.S. Army 1882 field manual on riots and how to handle them. And it grew out of the 1879 C&O Railroad strikes, which spread up the railroad to Chicago, and the Pullman Railroad strike and so forth. And it included how to clear a plant gate. You know, you form your unit into a wedge shape, and everybody fixes bayonets, and you walk through the crowd and you clear the plant gate.
Well, there was a lot of mischief in riot making on the part of the the communists.
Oh yeah.
And one of the things that I'd like to hear you comment on is what about their efforts to infiltrate the civil rights movement?
Well, that's a whole book or two, of which I could write a volume or two of it myself. They did. I got files around here on RIDs and civil rights and so forth.
How did they manage to resist that influence.
Well, they didn't entirely. You can still see today. I picked this clip up. Effects linger from anti-Klan rampage of 1982. This is a newspaper clipping from 1985 thereabouts. Anyhow, the anti-Klan rampage of 1982 involved an effort to capitalize on the hatred of the Klan by most liberals, right-thinking Americans, and so they would stage an anti-Klan rally, you know, and they'd get more people. They'd say, oh, the Klan has got a scheduled march on such and such a date and time and place, so we're going to protest their march, like in what was it, Mount Zion, Illinois, or wherever it was, famous case. Skokie, yeah. And so they'd put this thing on, and they would be in the posture of an anti-Klan rally, and they'd get more reporters who'd be gulled by the fact that a Klansman was going to show up in full regalia. And I remember clipping one story out of California where they got 14 Klansmen and about 400 newspaper people out to cover this Klan march. So that kind of thing goes on. But anyhow, coming back to the Zingakuren riots of 1960, that got me started. There was one volume in the Library of Congress on riots, 1882 manual. So I started digging, and I called the State Department. I said, Mac Kilduff answered the phone. He was a friend of mine from way back. Mac was later White House press secretary, and he wound up announcing Kennedy's death to the nation and the world. But I said, Mac, I want to do a story about riots. And at that point, there were only riots in U.S. intelligence agency or U.S. information agency posts around the world. Overseas riots. There was no riots in the United States in the early 60s. And I said, I want to come over and I want to read clips first, then I want to come over and talk to somebody who's an expert on this. I didn't get a call back from Mac for 3 weeks, and I finally called him up and said, Mac, what's going on? He says, well, Gene, he says, I've hesitated to call you because I was ashamed to call you. Really, he says, we don't have any experts on that. We don't have any clip files. And he says, I've checked all the sources. He meant the pickle factory, the CIA, which was then located up on the hill from the State Department. So anyway, I said, well, this is a national scandal. And that resulted in a series of stories in the Reader's Digest. I wrote about a 100-page article, not a research paper, on riots, and found myself to be the riot expert of the United States, by the way, according to the U.S. Army, which invited me to lecture at the Army War College on riots. I said, who me? Little old me from Vienna, Georgia.
I was in London in April of 1960 when Mr. Bertrand Russell came in there with what was advertised as the largest anti-war demonstration, anti-nuclear demonstration.
Bertrand Russell.
Yeah. And what about the infiltration of the so-called anti-war movement?
Well, that was through people like Russell's fellow travelers and so on. Fellow traveler was a person who would go along with the communists on most anything. They didn't care. They just were against the war. And the communists would come and say, we're against the war, so let's united front it. So they'd be against the war and against the Ku Kluxers and against everything else. And people would sign on and so forth. We're against war. Well, communists were against war. They'd much rather take over the world peacefully. And anyway, the riot makers, we got, I got to be an expert on that. I published a 100-page, I wrote a 100-page paper, research paper for the Digest, which got smashed into one paragraph. Talk about digesting.
Uh-huh.
This was in my early years of writing for the Digest. And I published an article in Orbis Quarterly, which was the Foreign Policy Research Institute of the University of Pennsylvania. And Steve Pisoni was my mentor in those years, my intellectual mentor. He was a professor of history at Georgetown University. Now I went to, this is how things work in Washington. I went to the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, which had published a book on communist mob violence around the world, a little pamphlet, thin pamphlet, and it was written by Ben Mandel, who was the research director up there. So I went up and sat down with Ben Mandel, who later became a good friend. I said, Ben, tell me about riots. He says, okay, but he says, if you really want to know about this, you got to go to the Pentagon and talk to Steve Pisoni. Well, let me put that aside for a minute, come back to Pisoni. Ben Mandel turned out to be he was the research director of the committee. He turned out to be the ex-Communist Party member who had handed Whittaker Chambers his party card, sworn him in the 1920s into the Communist Party. Ben was a true believing communist in those years, as were many other anti-war, anti-personalities. Mm-hmm. And so he says, go see Steve Pisoni. So I went to Dr. Pisoni, who was a professor of history at Georgetown University in daytime, but he also had I never did quite understand, he had a job as advisor to the Deputy Director of Intelligence for the U.S. Air Force. And Steve's claim to fame was in 1949, when everybody said, oh, it'll be years before the Russians can catch up with us in nuclear research. Steve says, horse feathers, they'll do it. They're going to explode a weapon in 3 months. Well, you know the result of that.
Yep, sure did.
They exploded the weapon in 1950, and Steve became the person to go to. In fact, he won the highest U.S. government award for civilians for that forecast. And he also was the most protean intellect I've ever known. He was an Austrian by birth, or Austro-Hungarian. He was from Vienna, Austria, the son of an opera star who said that he wouldn't come to the Metropolitan Opera because it'd never amount to anything. But anyhow, Steve escaped from Austria in 1938 when the Nazis took over. He got away with his underpants and what he had in his briefcase. You know, he just made it out just one jump ahead of the Gestapo. From Paris. He went from Vienna to Paris to Marseille to the United States.
Were you surprised at the way the Cold War ended?
Oh yeah, it surprised me. Anyway, the speed of the collapse, it didn't surprise me the way it ended. I thought from my 1974 visit to the Soviet Union, that relieved a lot of pressure for me, because I came home convinced that their system was not in any way competitive with ours, that it would collapse of its own weight if we kept our powder dry. That meant our missiles ready and our nuclear weapons armed and ready to launch on warning. And believe me, that was quite a tall order. But they collapsed right out of surprise. It surprised me, but it didn't surprise Pisoni, because I quoted him in an article in the Reader's Digest during the Brezhnev era in 1977. That article appeared, Succession Crisis in the Kremlin. I had a question mark behind something like that. Anyhow, what Steve said was the current Brezhnev era of stagnation may be a manifestation of deadlock rather than a manifestation of stability. And perhaps after Brezhnev, things will change with a rapidity that will dazzle us. And he said that. He was a very wise man. And of course it happened with Gorbachev. We went from, let's see, Brezhnev, Chernenko, Andropov. There was a third in there. Chernenko.
No, that was Chernenko and Andropov.
Yeah, there was a third.
And then
Gorbachev.
Then Gorbachev.
Yeah. But anyway, the point is, during all this time, there was an underground in the Soviet Union of people who had thought themselves free of the Stalinist, Leninist dominance, the cult, if you will. And
what caused it to end when it did?
Well, the resistance of the old true believers was such that there was a split, and they were going head to head. And then in January of 1991, the Lithuanians and the Baltics all were demanding freedom, and the Lithuanians in effect declared their independence, and they gathered, all of them around town, gathered down in front of the radio stations in downtown Lithuania. We're going to defend them from the Russian Spetsnaz, the Russian special troops that the conservatives sent to take them back over. And they killed a bunch of people on January 13th of 1991, and you got to salute these people. They did not flinch. They're like the Libyans today or the Tunisians today. They didn't flinch at the first firings of bloodshed, the first drops of blood. And so Yeltsin went up there and took a stand with him. Now, Yeltsin was one of the heroes of history, and along with several others that I could name, whose names are meaningless to Americans. I say I could name them. I can't name them right offhand because I can't remember squat. But they had thought their way free. One of whom was Gorbachev's bosom buddy, the former ambassador to Canada. He'd been a World War II hero at the siege of Leningrad, wounded, and became a Communist Party member. And he was present the day the anti-Stalin speech was made at the Kremlin. Who made it? He was Khrushchev. Khrushchev made the anti-Stalin speech. And the CIA got a copy of it and published it to the astonishment of the Kremlin. But that's another story. Anyway, he'd been present the day that speech was made, and he had never let his doubts go. He just stayed in place, minded his time. He wrote an article later. He was regarded as one of the brightest young men in the Communist Party. He was an up-and-coming Communist member, and then after Brezhnev took over with the hardliners, he wrote a mildly dissenting critical piece, and so they exiled him to Canada as ambassador. And he was in Canada when Gorbachev came over after Gorbachev's election, before Gorbachev's election in 1989. 81, 82. And they palled around together. The ambassador to Canada, of course, was the host ambassador. And they found a lot in common. They had had doubts about the system. Shevardnadze, who was Gorbachev's equivalent in Georgia, and Gorbachev was, they were provincial chiefs.
What was the impact of Gorbachev's decision to withdraw the shoot to kill order in Berlin?
Oh, well, that goes back to Hungary, and the impact was huge. Of course, the wall came down immediately. When somebody says about Albania, they said, what would happen if there were no shoot to kill order in Albania? And somebody says, even the turtles would run. That's true of the Germans too. And they were going through Hungary, and Hungarians deserve a lot of credit for the fall of the wall. And you know, the Russian people too, they thought their way free of the Stalin image. And by the way, Stalin was popular when he died. There are stories about the hysteria that spread when Stalin died. Yeah. And by the way, I was at the University of Georgia in March 1953 and dropped out that quarter because my father died a couple of months after that. But I was at the University of Georgia when Stalin died, 1953, and that's when the Soviet Union began to unwind, because people can't live in terror. And I knew it from 1972 on, 74 on. I could see the handwriting on the wall, but I thought it'd take 100 years to take place.
You're talking about Hitler and Stalin, and you consider today people like Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein, or what?
Saddam, by the way, had Stalin's collected works on his shelf when he died. He kept them in the library right off his bedroom.
Yeah. What
And,
what produces this kind of
that
Ronald
gets
Reagan?
you back to genetics, and I don't know.
How do they acquire power? People like Hitler, Stalin.
They do it, or Lenin. Lenin acquired power first. They do it by masquerading, masters of deceit. J. Edgar Hoover called them.
Yeah.
That's something that Ronald Reagan understood. He understood that you know, he fought the unions, the mafia takeover of the unions in Hollywood before he got interested in politics. He was president of the Screen Actors Guild in Hollywood, and he fought the communists and the mafia types at that level, and he knew them up close. And
there were a lot of people who were faint-hearted and thought that he overspoke when he made his Evil Empire speech, and when he urged Secretary Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
What do you think about those? That language and that rhetoric.
The rhetoric was golden, and the language, of course, he understood the basics of the psychology of the psychopathic personality who has no conscience whatsoever, and he understood the commonality between the Kremlin and the mafia, and he treated them alike, dealing with them. And he recognized in Gorbachev a different type personality, because Stalin would have chopped heads off left and right without a hesitation.
He
Gorbachev, Yes, he did. Gorbachev hesitated, and
Yeah, I think the withdrawal of the shoot to kill order in Berlin
oh yeah.
was an indication of that he was not
Well,
going to use
I witnessed personally a conversation between Ben Mandel again, this ex-communist, and Serafino Romaldi, who was an Italian-born anti-fascist refugee in the trade unions. And he was a linotype operator, among other things. He operated on the Italian newspaper in New York when he came as a refugee from Mussolini. And I witnessed a conversation between the two of them in 1968 when Brezhnev and company sentenced Sanyavsky and Daniel. Remember those two writers, two dissidents? They were headlines in the world then. Sentenced them to years in the Gulag. And I witnessed that pair of people at a cocktail party in the press club, as I remember it. And they were looking at each other in amazement. And they said, they've lost the taste for blood. And they forecast the end of the evil empire then. They said, they've lost the taste for blood. Well, that was a sign that Gorbachev, that Brezhnev and company had lost the taste for blood. Now, they went on for 20 more years, 25 years. History unwinds awful slowly, sometimes.
So to what extent do you give, if some people do, John Paul credit for the unraveling of the...
He deserves a little credit.
He what?
He deserves a little credit. You mean the Pope?
Yes.
And the Polish, oh yeah, he deserves a lot of credit. So does Reagan. But not all the credit, because the credit belongs really to people like that ambassador to Canada that I mentioned, and Shevardnadze and Gorbachev, who thought their way free of the situation. There's a story, and I think it's in books that you'll find on the shelves here. Khrushchev remembers how his first volume was published in the West because the Politburo wouldn't allow it to be published. And so he smuggled it out. And they called him before them at a point after it had been published in the West, and he was working on his second volume of memoirs, which he smuggled also. And they said, how could you, of all people, you were our leader for, 10 years, 56 to 84, 53 to 84. Yeah, got those dates right. You were our leader for 10 years, and yet you published these memoirs which are scandalously against us. And Khrushchev looked at them and said, I freed myself of the image of Stalin, and you didn't. Not the image, but the aura, the ambiance, the dominance of Stalin.
I think it was 56 to 64, was it not?
Yeah.
What about Mrs. Thatcher?
Oh, she was important too, and she led us back to the idea of Alexander Hamilton and so forth. Noblesse, not noblesse oblige, but laissez-faire. That phrase comes from a conversation between Colbert, the French minister of finance before the revolution. He called in a bunch of businessmen and said, hey, look, we got a system that doesn't work. We got to get it work. What do we do as a government? And this nobleman says, get out of the way, stay out of the way, leave us alone, he says. Laissez-faire, give us the freedom to do, and we'll take care of everything else. Just stay out of the way.
Let me digress it a little bit. you told me once about an encounter you had with George Lincoln Rockwell.
Oh, yeah.
I'd like to get that on the record if we could.
Okay. All right. That was in the spring of 1959. I was with the Daily News, and Rockwell popped up in the news that morning. There was a bombing of a synagogue down in Atlanta, the Temple bombing, 1959. Mm-hmm. It was big news
Yep.
on local papers anyway, and terrorism was not known. The Klan was blamed with that, and I went into the office one morning, and I started at 5:30 when I was the anchor rewrite man. We had to say, I told you, I said we had to be at the coffee breaks at 10 o'clock for government workers, because about a third of our circulation was sold on the newsstand at 10 o'clock. Mm-hmm. So we had a deadline of 8:15, and I came in that morning. There was an overnight wire service story out of Atlanta that Rockwell, George Lincoln Rockwell, had been found to be in cahoots with the Klan in Atlanta, the Klan group suspected of the bombing, and city editor called me over and said, "Hey, see what you can find out about this." So I started calling Rockwell, who lived in Arlington, Virginia, right here. And I started calling Rockwell, and every other city-side reporter in town had been calling him, for all the radio stations, all the TV, and the Post and Star. And we went on this way in the panic mode for 2 hours, 3 hours. And 8:15 approached, and the city editor was spinning on his ear. He didn't have any copy. And so we were calling all the neighbors, trying to get quotes about Rockwell and everything else, you know. Well, finally at 8:15, I made one last attempt to dial Rockwell's residence. And son of a gun, he answered the phone. He himself answered the phone. And I found myself on the phone with the most wanted man in America at the moment by the press. The article, United Press said, well, this letter had been found in a footlocker of one of the people suspected of the bombing. And the letter said something about a fat cat in Baltimore, etc., signed George Lincoln Rockwell, and gave his address. And this was the only clue as to the identity of the bombers, and so everybody was wanting to talk to Rockwell. And I had him on the phone for an interview for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and I got some good quotes from him. And I knew at the time that he was nuts. I mean, he just sounded nuts, but he sounded, and this was a learning experience for me as a young reporter at age 24, 25. He sounded like a nut, but he looked normal, and that's a disparity that is baffling to a lot of people. Mm-hmm. It unhinges you to talk to somebody who's speaking nonsense, and you know it, and he looks perfectly normal. Mm-hmm. He believes it's nonsense. Mm-hmm. So he was talking about the Jews and everything else, you know. So I was taking us all down and writing it, and the city editor was standing at my typewriter snatching it out, paragraph by paragraph. As fast as I'd put a period, he'd snatch it out and start to edit it and send it down to the composing room. Well, came out the 11 o'clock story, the 10 o'clock story, exclusive interview with Rockwell. And that was on the front pages all over America. And so...
Nobody had ever heard of George.
No, he was a nobody. He was a nobody whose wife had left him at that point. He had a little house rented in Arlington, and he had a multi-lith 1250 printing press, and he was earning his living making sales signs for grocery stores. By the way, Hitler did that too in Vienna in 1914, thereabouts.
After he got kicked out of art school, like
Yeah, right.
Between Hitler and Stalin, who would you say was the most destructive evil?
Oh, Stalin by far. Yeah, by far, even in the deaths he caused.
Yeah.
But that's another story. Anyhow, let me wind up this Rockwell story.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Rockwell.
I thought you had.
Yeah. I got a lot of loose ends. I returned to Rockwell later, called him up, got a nice interview with him, long story in the paper, and he'd been a nobody in Arlington with, this little business. His wife had left him. She'd gone back to Iceland, where she was from, and he was living alone, and within a week or two, he'd had a dozen or 24 people who like to dress up in Nazi uniforms and parade around. Stormtroopers, in other words. They all believed that, anyhow, my story had galvanized this little group of Nazis from all over America. They'd come in on Rockwell and moved in with him over there. He didn't say no to anybody. And so he wound up as the guru of the Nazi Party. The founder, really. And he was later assassinated by one of those lunatics he attracted through the media like me. But he got the party started. And today, they still meet on Rockwell's birthday or Hitler's birthday or something like that. And they get a couple of 20,000, a couple of 10,000 from all over the United States together. And it's an impressive.
10,000 people show up.
10 or 20, yeah. Those figures, I saw a TV special on this here recently. And 10 or 20,000 show up, and that's an impressive bunch of people. If you go looking at
Sure.
And you get a lot of people in there who are misfits and crazy as hell, and they get together though, and they make a mob and a political party. And excuse me, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask you if you had any other loose ends you wanted to.
Oh, all kinds of loose ends. Anyhow, I recognize Rockwell was the head nut, and his power, his responsiveness, or his leadership in this mob was critical, because he demonstrated the capacity to call the media together, and the media people, the medium is the message. The media people broadcast his message widely, and he drew from everybody, from all the ranks of the normal people, everybody who's tilted, nuts, unbalanced. And that's true of the communists, the Scientologists, the LaRouches.
They can't survive without nuts.
Well, they are all of them are nuts, a little bit. And a lot of the trouble begins though when the nuts get a message, like Lenin and Stalin, Marxist message that appeals widely and explains a lot of things, and they learn to magnify that message, and the nuts coagulate, the nuts collect, and then they create a political party, and they learn to train others like themselves who are mildly attracted to the message or heavily attracted to the message. And that was the beginning of my third book, which will now not be written, The Hate Machine. And I read a book called The Molding of the Cadres by Frank S. Meyer, M-E-Y-E-R, who is an ex-communist member who wrote a book about the molding of the cadres, literally, how they molded personalities into true believing communists. And that book stimulated me a lot, and Rockwell, the experience of organizing, as I said, he and I organized together the Nazi Party.
You put them on the map.
I put them on the map.
That meant you had been some other reporter, though.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I had some help. Tom Kelly of the Washington Daily News went out and did a story about Rockwell about 3 months later. He says, George Lincoln Rockwell has the best room of any boy on his block. And he went on to describe the room and the uniforms and everything else. And you came away with this vision of a kid who was play acting and harmless and would outgrow it, but he didn't outgrow it.
Can we move to the 21st century?
Yeah.
What do you think is the biggest threat we face today?
Oh, it's the terrorist movement. You know, we got a new movement going now of intellectuals who represent the Green Party, the Green parties all over the nation, all over the world. And they've got an ideology that will allow them to pose as saviors of mankind. And it's the beginnings of a troublesome era. The terrorists, yeah, you got terrorist fringes with all the green movements in the United States. The FBI's got them on tail. They've bombed and set fires to they let rats go. They go into the laboratories and let monkeys go, and you know, they raid. They're all fringe nuts, but they're nuts, and they're psychopathic behaviors ignited by behaviorists, ignited by the vision of a green world, a utopian vision. And that's a critical thing, and that is, if by this action you can for all time end all problems for all mankind and bring about utopia, then killing this person may seem like a small price to pay. It's the classic question asked by Alyosha in Tolstoy's, not Tolstoy, Alyosha was the brothers Karamazov. He was the holy one who said, Alyosha's dream was a dream about an interview with Jesus. Oh my. The Grand Inquisitor, thank you. The Grand Inquisitor, right. The Grand Inquisitor episode in Alyosha's dream was the Grand Inquisitor asked a question. If by slaughtering this one innocent babe you could bring about utopia for all time, would you be justified in taking the life of that babe?
Are you asking me?
No. Yeah, that's the logic of these people.
Yeah. What about Islamic fundamentalism?
They're the same bunch. Islamists are among the most civilized people, and Islamic people, Muslims, are among those most civilized, sedate people in the world. My wife went to work in 1960 for the press counselor at the Royal Embassy of Iran, and he's still living today. Bent, older than I am by 20 years, and he's one of the most delicious people you'll ever know.
And he lives here in Washington?
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. He lives right up the street from me in my old home, Ali Shapurian. And you know, the Muslims have a long tradition of civilization, civility, and so on. But these Islamists are nuts.
Mm-hmm. We had a attack on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center on September the 11th, 2001. We're coming up on the 10th anniversary of that attack in about 6 months. We've had terrorist events since then, but are you surprised that there's been no major terrorist incidents comparable to 9/11 2001?
That's due to the FBI and anti-terrorism police all over the world, and people who don't cotton to that kind of thing. People who disagree with Alyosha's Grand Inquisitor, or I had a Russian cite for me the 15th century or 16th century Thomas Campanella. He was an Italian utopian socialist, you know, and he asked the same question. And he said, you know, if I could bring in utopia for all time, it would not justify my harming the hair on a head of an innocent babe, one hair. Now, Thomas Campanella said that, and there were a lot of Russians who believed that, and I had Thomas Campanella quoted to me in the kitchen dinette suite of the editor of the publication on the United States and Russia by Arbitrov's Yuri Arbitrov was the chief criminologist, or the chief White Houseologist, or the chief Americanologist of the Soviet Union. Georgy Arpatov, yeah. And the editor of his publication was a hostess for us when we visited Moscow in 1992. She received us, welcomed us into her home.
How many times did you go to Moscow?
Twice. Then once in 1974 and once in 92 after Yeltsin stood on the tank and defied him. Anyhow, she mused one night. Her name was Viola, and I said, that's a Western name. She said, yes, it is, because her parents had gone, mesmerized by this Leninist, Marxist dream of a perfect society for all time. They'd gone and into Siberia to, we just come from there. Lake Baikal is near it's right out halfway. What's the name of the town? Anyhow, we'd just come from there. Her parents had gone out there in the 1930s. They were building socialism. That old saw that was Stalin's and Marxist pap or camouflage of the reality. And she said they were internationalists. They believed they were bringing in utopia for all time, for all mankind, and they wanted their daughter to have an international name, so they picked Viola.
Now, you and Barbara took a lot of interesting trips. Was that one the most interesting? Or
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we took a lot of trips.
What were some of the other interesting places you went?
Well, Beijing, but that was only later after I changed my foreign policy. I figured enough time had gone by after the Tiananmen Square murders to maybe do business with them to the extent of going and seeing. After all, they occupied real estate invented the first paper and so forth, the Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd done a story about, I had a chapter in The Rise of Radicalism about the Chinese Communist Party. Mm-hmm. You know, in 1916, 18, Sun Yat-sen asked the ambassador from the United States for help he asked the United States to take over China and help them install democracy in China. Mm. And the American ambassador, who was a wise man, he said he didn't even transmit that offer to Washington because it was so ridiculous for the United States to take over China and teach them democracy. But Sun Yat-sen did, and I've got it in The Rise of Radicalism. The United States is unique in history, and they had turned to us the way the Libyans have today, the eastern half of Libya anyway.
So you share Ronald Reagan's vision as a shining city on the hill in the United States of America.
No, that's utopianism. Hey, let's take a break.
Okay.
Well, we'll start over with that one.
Yeah, you talked about the commonality between the mafia and communism.
Reagan understood that, and that was his gift, really. He understood the commonality of the element of psychopathic behavior, psychopathic personality. They had a large number of psychopathic personalities in either movement. Those were the killers, the people without conscience, the left end of the spectrum, the right end of the spectrum. I don't care which end of the spectrum you put them on. There are people in the world who just have no conscience whatsoever. And they're Hitlers, they're Stalins, they're Lenins, they're Karl Marxes. They stick up grocery stores, they shoot people, they kill people, they torture. Serial killers they found out Son of Sam in New York City was a serial killer, but he also set thousands of fires, false alarms, turned them in. Every person who is a serial killer is a psychopath. They torture people. They take pleasure from these things. It's hard to understand, but Hitler used to take a pleasure from he took great pleasure. There's a story of him and somebody at one of his Gauleiters, or it was either Hitler's table talk. He would have these conversations in the mornings around his lunch table, and he would ask various people like Goering in. By the way, Hermann Goering was an interesting person who had a younger brother who was an anti-Nazi. Goering was clearly a psychopathic personality. And I've known brothers of psychopathic personalities who were upstanding citizens. But that's another story. It was a story in the Reader's Digest in 1979 called New Light on the New Light on the Criminal Personality. There are people in the world who take just as much pleasure out of stealing 50 cents as they do out of stealing $50 million.
Mm-hmm. How did Reagan manifest?
Well, Reagan understood this. Reagan understood the personality because he dealt with it in the Screen Actors Guild in Hollywood as president, and as coming along, he dealt with the mafia He crossed swords with them out there, and he dealt with the communists the same way. And he knew that there was a similar element in the Communist Party.
What was your most memorable experience with Ronald Reagan?
Well, that was one night sitting at my desk in Washington. I got a call from the White House, and it was the White House Research Office. Somebody says, this lady on the other end of the line says, Mr. Methven, you've been referred to us as an expert on Lenin, and we're trying to research a speech by the president, and he's got a quote of Lenin he wants to quote, and we want to track it down. I said, okay, give me the quote, and I'll see if I can identify it. Well, they gave me the quote. It's a rather famous one. Lenin spoke in 1919 or 20 to the young communist leagues in Russia, or the worldwide, as they called them, and they were pretensing. I mean, they were pretentious as all get out, but they were pretending to themselves, among others, they were young communist leagues, and they were going to take over the world. That was a part of their appeal. Young people believe anything. And I said, give me the quote. She read it, and I said, well, that sounds like Lenin in 1919 at the Young Communist League. He made a speech to them. I said, and I'll check it out for you and call you tomorrow. And I said, I've got Lenin's collected works at home. Now that is a story in itself. How did I happen to have the 45 volumes, at this point in the early 60s? Lenin was a great hero and a great humanitarian, and they had a hagiography of him. They put together these volumes of everything the man had said or spoken, 45 volumes of it. And it was a young professor from Georgia Tech, young instructor from Georgia Tech, who put me onto that. He came to Washington in the early 60s, and he said, Gene, you got to get these volumes of Lenin's collected works. I said, for God's sakes, what do you? I said, the collected works of Lenin, how many are there? He says, there are 45 of them. I said, good Lord, I can't afford that. He said, well, they're published, and you can order them through the bookstore in Canada, Toronto, and they're $1.25 a piece, 45 of them. I said, well, that's a lot of money in 1960. I said, I'll try. Richard V. Allen was his name. He later was Ronald Reagan's National Security Advisor.
Yep, friend of mine.
He was an instructor at Georgia Tech when I spied his letters to the editor, and Gene Patterson would cross swords with him in print every now and then, and I found out he'd come to Washington and gone to work as the first executive director of the Georgetown Center on Strategic International Studies. And so I ordered the collected works of Lenin, and they comprise about, they gave me biographies of Lenin and so on, gave me about 50%, about 2/3 of the, I guess about 30% of the copy in The Rise of Radicalism is a biography of Lenin, or Lenin's role in the foundation of the international communist parties, how he started them up in each country.
And
I researched and read in Lenin, in the published works of Lenin, a lot of stuff. So here the White House wanted this checked out, and I said, well, I'll go home and check it out for you, and I'll call you back tomorrow. The lady says, well, actually the president was hoping to use it in a speech tomorrow. I said, well, wait a minute, I'll go right now. This was late in the afternoon, 6:30 or so. I'd wait out the rush hour. I said, I'll go right now and call you back in an hour. So I did, and I got home. Oh, first of all, I said, listen, I said, if you really want to check this out with an expert, I said, call Dr. Stephen Pisoni at the Hoover Library at Stanford University in California. I said, he is the leading expert on Lenin in the United States, as far as I know. I says, and he's just finished a biography of Lenin. Well, she was silent for a moment, and then she says, we already checked with Dr. Pisoni. He referred us to you. I said, who, me? Little old me from the University of Georgia? I said, I think I told her, I said, the country's in a hell of a state for biographies, for expertise on Lenin. And by the way, that was true in that era. Very few people had read Lenin. And I got into it with those collected works after I remember going to the State Department in 1960 and interviewing a guy named Bob Terrell, who was top assistant to Undersecretary Douglas Dillon in at the last days of the Eisenhower administration. He was being put out to pasture at the Army War College, at the U.S. War College in Fort McNair, as his last assignment. And he says to me, he says, you know, Gene, there are probably not 200 people in this country who understand really what Lenin was talking about. And that pricked my interest. And I had interviews later with Richard Allen, and we were talking about, at that time, the Congo. A lot of people forget Katanga, and the Congo dominated the headlines for years then. But anyway, I got into Lenin as a result of those experiences, and I said to her, well, the country's in a hell of a state for an expert on Lenin. If Steve Pisoni is referring to Eugene Methvin, I said, but I'll check this quote for you and call you right back. So I went home and I got the volumes on the shelf over there, and I said, I looked at it was right where I found it. I'd underlined it, and I have a system. I underline purple pencil and everything in purple pencil when I'm reading, except I put green pencil beside quotes that I consider ultra important. They're quotes worthy of the Reader's Digest, in other words, digest copy. And I'd underline that one in green, and I called her back and confirmed the quote.
And that was part of it. That went into his Evil Empire speech.
Yeah. And by the way, the Evil Empire speech was written by a guy named Tony Dolan.
Yeah, know him well.
Yeah. Tony was responsible for the president's crusade against organized crime. He got the president to appoint a commission on organized crime, and he got me on the commission. As a result of that encounter.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You were talking about psychopathic behavior and
personalities
and evil in the world. Do you think there's ever a no rational explanation for an irrational act, like Lee Harvey Oswald or this guy in Tucson who shot up?
Yeah. Is there a rational explanation? There's rationality. What's a rational explanation for an irrational act?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think sometimes there is a rational explanation for irrational.
No, the rationality comes in the explanation of psychopathy, and you know, that's the third book now that will never be written because I'm too old and too demented to write it.
No, that's too bad.
But
I wouldn't.
The world's leading expert. The world's leading expert on psychopathic behavior, psychopathy, is a friend of mine, Bob Hare, at the University of British Columbia. Bob Hare is a Canadian, and he is my age, and he got started on psychopathy as his first job out of the Canadian Air Force, actually. He was RCAF at the time. I was USAF. He was in the Air Defense Command. He flew P-51s, and I flew F-86s. So Bob Hare became the world's leading expert on psychopathy because a psychopath in his encounter tried to kill him and his wife and child, his infant baby, by filing his brake lines when he was leaving his first job to go back to graduate school.
Gene, it's been a long day, I know, and on behalf of the Russell Foundation and the Russell Library, I really want to thank you for this interview. I'd like to close with a couple of questions about, do you stay in touch with the University of Georgia?
Oh, yeah.
And how do you stay in touch with them?
Well, I'm on a couple of boards down there. The Dean's Council, the College of Franklin College of Arts and Sciences, I'm on that. I was on the University Libraries board up until I got too many boards there. I've been on the alumni out-of-state vice president. That's 30, 40 years ago. And I've been on the Journalism School Advisory Board, and I go to football games every fall.
And you also go to the reunion of Wally's boys, I guess.
Yes, I do.
And you see a lot of great personalities.
Yeah,
yeah.
I do.
Yeah. How has the University of Georgia changed since you walked on there as the campus as a freshman some 60 years ago?
Well, 4,000 students when I entered in 1951, 35,000 today. This is a big change, but the big change before I got there was the World War II veterans exited the university, and they had a lot of empty desks to fill. The World War II veterans had graduated. The population of the university went from 10,000 down to 4,000. There was no graduating class in about a half of the Georgia high schools that year either. So I went to the meeting in the spring before I entered of the Georgia Scholastic Press Association, which was Dean Drury's little baby. And we had a journalism student assigned to conduct us around campus. We were silly little college, high school students. And I remember standing on the steps of the chapel at Athens, and I said to this student, I said, how does one get into the University of Georgia? And he says, well, there goes Dr. Downer right across campus now. He said, he's the registrar, go ask him. So I walked up to Dr. Downer and I said, Dr. Downer, I'm Eugene Methvin from Vienna, Georgia, and I want to come to Athens in the fall to school. How do I get in? Well, Dr. Downer snatched out an envelope and a pencil. He says, son, give me your name and address right now. He says, I'm going back to my office. I'll send you an application blank as soon as I get back there, and you fill it out, and we'll admit you. Well, he almost had a tear in his eye to think here was a live body who wanted to come fill one of those empty desks at Athens that he was worried about in the fall, because we were going from 10,000 down to 4,000.
Yeah, the admission standards are a little higher.
Oh, yeah. And the university has grown immensely, and I might add it's grown with the support of the citizens of Georgia, and the alumni now contributing so much more than the state legislature, I believe, does in taxes, because the taxes don't begin to cover the bill of the university, first-class university. And Georgians have always loved the University of Georgia. I don't care whether it was Wally Butts or before Wally. You know, the charter, go back and read that charter, 1785. It was an idealistic charter, 1785, penned by Abraham Baldwin, who was the first president of the university. He was a legislator, a Yale graduate, And 1785 was before the Constitution of the United States was written. And he embodied in that charter the dreams of a lot of people for the American Republic. And they went out and they carved out a place on the Indian frontier. And they have the sheriff of Athens, Clark County, by the way, still leads the commencement parade every year with his sword drawn to keep away the Indians. But that was a dream that they had of a city on the hill, Athens, and they called it Athens. The legislators of this youngest state, Georgia, named and started the year George Washington was born, 1733-32, and 1785 was the charter. It was the youngest colony and the youngest state in the legislature, and they had these idealistic dreams of a republic on the frontier, and the people did.
Thank you very much. Been a very good interview. Been a pleasure for me, and I hope it has been for you.
Oh, it has been.